We're going to start in Ezekiel chapter 28. This talks about Satan himself. Begins in verse 14. We'll begin in verse 14. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth. And I have set thee so, thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways in the day that thou wast created, till iniquity was found in thee. This is talking about Satan. It calls him an anointed cherub that covereth. Now that phrase is real significant. When Moses was to make the tabernacle, he was to make the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was to be in the most holy place. The front of that tabernacle was called the holy place. The back of it was curtained off, and the priests only went once a year. And God said to build a covenant there, an ark there, and to put cherubims on either end of the ark facing one another, whose wings would totally cover the ark. And they're called in the scripture the cherubims that covered. And then God said, I will meet you there. That was the place where God's presence was where the cherubims were over the ark, which is called also the mercy seat. Now, when he calls Satan the anointed cherub that covereth, he's letting you know that he was in the presence of God. Because those cherubims that covered that ark were where God always came to speak to Moses. So he was in the presence of God. He was upon the holy mountain of God. That's where God lived, where God had residence, where his throne was. So he was in the presence of God. He was in the place where God reigned and ruled. And then you'll find out he knew the power of God. Now this is Satan in all his perfection before his fall. This is who he was before he totally changed by sin. It says you were perfect in your ways. I always like that. That's always been my goal. I always wanted to be perfect. Now I already found out I'm never going to make it. I'm not going to quit trying. But can you imagine? Now earlier in the scripture it said of Satan that he was perfect in beauty. He was the most magnificent of God's creation. He's a created being, an angel who had access to the presence of God, who had been in the place of God, and who knew the power of God. Now the reason I know that verse 14 said he'd walked up and down the midst of the stones of fire, and that word stones is construction stones or building blocks. He was magnificent. He had authority. He had a heavenly assignment. He knew God. He had access to God's presence. And yet what happened was, it says iniquity was found in him. He decided he'd promote himself. Never a good idea. God didn't have a problem with Satan. He cast him to the ground. That's in verse 17. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings that they may behold thee. He cast him out of heaven. And then all the words Satan's talked about in perfection. He's talked about perfect in beauty. He's talked about perfect in wisdom. He's talked about being in God's presence, being in God's place, knowing God's power. And suddenly the whole tenor of Scripture has changed, and he's considered violent and defiled and profane. Sin changed him. And he's the originator of sin. That's why that's important to you. Now look at Isaiah 14. He's the originator of sin. It says he's profane. He's vain. He's destructive. Isaiah 14 tells this same story from a slightly different perspective. Verse 12. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer? Now why did he fall from heaven? You remember? He was perfect. He chose sin. He chose rebellion. He tried to take over for God, and they cast him to the ground. How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? The characteristics of Satan are very clear. He's destructive. He brings weakness. He takes away strength. He said, thou hast said in the heart, I will ascend into heaven. I'll exalt my throne. That means he had a God-given realm of authority. He had an assignment from heaven. He didn't stay true to his assignment. He wrote his own book, and God cast him out. Now that's important to us because when Jesus comes to be the sacrifice for sin, he came for our benefit, not for his own. Because when Satan caused confusion in heaven and became vile and profane and destructive, they cast him out. So God wasn't having a problem with Satan. It was me. It was you and I. Now look at Psalms 107. And this is God's goal in bringing to pass the great plan of redemption. And this is how we're going to participate in that plan. You know, you can work for a company that has the finest insurance plan, the finest medical insurance plan, life insurance plan. But you have to become a part of that plan. That plan passes you by unless you understand the plan. You sign your signature on some documents and say, I want to be a part of the plan. Well, God has a plan, but it's not automatic. See, a lot of the church world says God does what he wants to, when he wants to, if he wants to. But I have news for you. That's not true. If I want to rob a bank tonight, God cannot prevent that. And he will not prevent that. Now, he'll influence me. And he'll call to me. And he'll try to re-steer me. And he'll send some of you to me. Say, Becky, you don't want to do that. But man was given a free will, so man has to make some choices. So God outlines in the scripture the choices that can be made. The curse that came and the blessing that came as a result of Jesus' death and resurrection. And then he said, let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Sign up for the plan. Sign in for the plan. Say so. Now, let's quote the other end of that verse because it's equally important. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Whom he hath redeemed from the hand of the enemy. Satan's the enemy.